Story 1. The Shadow in Room 204. The first time Emily noticed something off about her roommate, Rachel, it was subtle small things, barely worth mentioning. A door left ajar that Rachel always insisted on locking, a cup out of place. She chalked it up to nerves from moving into a new city for her first job, and anyway, they were too old for roommate drama. Both women were in their late 20s, professionals, having outgrown the messiness of college dorm life. Emily had found the room on Craigslist, and everything seemed ideal. A shared two-bedroom in a pre-war building downtown, cheap rent, and a roommate with a quiet demeanor. Rachel worked as a nurse at the local hospital, pulling night shifts often, which meant Emily had most of the evenings to herself. It was perfect. Or at least it seemed so. It started with the tapping. Late at night, when Emily would sit on the couch watching TV, she would hear it tap, tap, tap like fingernails lightly rapping on the window from the inside. At first, she blamed it on the pipes. Old buildings like this creaked and groaned. But the noise seemed oddly consistent, almost purposeful. Then Rachel began to change. Her once pale face grew gaunt, dark circles under her eyes deepening as if she were hollowing out from the inside. She avoided conversation, always mumbling that she had to sleep during the day because of her night shifts. But Emily couldn't help but feel like Rachel's night shifts were growing longer. She would disappear for days on end, not even returning to grab food from the fridge. One evening, Emily woke suddenly from a deep sleep, heart racing. She swore she had heard Rachel crying soft sobs, muffled through the thin walls of their shared apartment. Emily hesitated, but eventually pulled herself out of bed, the wooden floor cold under her bare feet, and knocked gently on Rachel's door. No answer. She knocked again. Nothing. Hesitant but worried, Emily tried the doorknob. It was unlocked. The room inside was dark, lit only by the pale glow of the city lights outside. Rachel wasn't there. Her bed was perfectly made, untouched for days. Yet, Emily felt it, that undeniable presence, the creeping sensation you get when you know you're being watched. It lingered in the air, thick and oppressive. Then she noticed the closet door was open just a crack. Her heart pounding, Emily walked closer. As she reached the closet, the sobbing returned, but this time it wasn't muffled. It was right there, inches away. Her hand shook as she reached for the closet door and swung it open. Nothing. The closet was empty, but the sobbing continued, louder now, more desperate. Emily stumbled back, the sensation of being watched intensifying, and she fled the room, slamming the door behind her. That night, she didn't sleep. The next morning, Rachel returned, acting like nothing was wrong. Emily asked about her late-night sobbing, but Rachel only smiled, a cold, thin-lipped smile that never reached her eyes, and said, "I've been working. You must be imagining things." Things escalated quickly after that. Emily began hearing voices in the middle of the night, not just the sobbing, but whispers, unintelligible, overlapping whispers, like someone was murmuring right into her ear. She thought she was losing her mind until she noticed something that sent chills down her spine. Rachel's reflection in the mirrors was off. It wasn't that Rachel's reflection didn't match her movements. No, it was worse than that. It was like a delay, a second too late, a second too soon. Sometimes Rachel's reflection would stand still while Rachel herself was moving. Once, Emily saw it smiling back at her while Rachel's face remained completely expressionless. Desperate, Emily turned to the building's super, an old man named Carl who had been there for years. When she asked about the apartment's history, he grew quiet, avoiding her eyes. "Room 204, you say?" he murmured, rubbing his chin. "Had a few complaints over the years, but nothing serious." Emily pressed him for details, and after some hesitation, Carl finally relented. 10 years ago, a woman named Sarah had lived in the apartment with her roommate, just like Emily and Rachel. Sarah had been a night nurse too, and according to the rumors, she'd become increasingly unhinged after her roommate died suddenly in the apartment. Some said it was an accident. Others believed foul play was involved. Either way, Sarah was found a few weeks later, dead by apparent suicide. The apartment had remained empty for years until the building was renovated and new tenants moved in. Emily's blood ran cold. The parallels were too eerie, too similar to be coincidental. Determined to get to the bottom of it, Emily started digging through old newspapers and archives, finding more about Sarah's tragic story. But what she found next sent her into a full-blown panic. An old police report from that time mentioned the name Rachel Stevens, the roommate who had died in that very apartment. Emily could hardly believe what she was reading. Her Rachel had never mentioned her last name, but surely it couldn't be the same one. Could it? Her heart raced as she realized the chilling truth. Rachel wasn't alive. She had never been. The Rachel she had been living with was some kind of entity, a ghost, a restless spirit, still trapped in the apartment, reliving the same nightmare over and over. Weeks later, Emily heard from Carl again. He told her that after she'd left, the apartment had been rented out again, this time to a young man. But within a week, the new tenant had moved out, claiming the place was haunted. He, too, had heard the sobbing, the tapping, and had seen something in the mirrors that shouldn't have been there. Rachel, or whatever was left of her, was still there, waiting. Story 2. The Tenant in the Basement. It was one of those late summer afternoons when the air feels thick and heavy, and the streets buzz with restless energy. Mike had just landed in the city for his new job, a fresh start after months of bouncing between gigs in his old town. The apartment search had been rough, but he finally found a place that fit his budget, a small 2-bedroom basement unit in an old brownstone. It wasn't fancy, but it was clean, and the landlord, Mrs. Henderson, seemed like a sweet, elderly woman, the kind who still baked cookies for new tenants. The only catch was that he'd have a roommate, a guy named Ben, who had already been living in the unit for a couple of months. Mrs. Henderson had assured him Ben was quiet, kept to himself, and worked nights. "You won't even know he's there," she'd said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Mike wasn't too concerned. He liked his space, but as long as Ben wasn't the partying type, it would be fine. The rent was cheap enough that he could put up with almost anything. Moving in was easy, just a few boxes and some old furniture. The first few days went by without incident. Ben kept to himself, just as Mrs. Henderson had said. Mike rarely saw him, though sometimes late at night, he'd hear the guy moving around in his room or walking down the narrow hallway. Ben's door was always closed, and it seemed he preferred it that way. But there was something off about the situation. Every time Mike tried to say hello or introduce himself, Ben would avoid eye contact, mumble something under his breath, and disappear back into his room. It wasn't outright hostility, but the atmosphere between them was tense, like Ben was deliberately trying to keep distance. Mike wrote it off as social awkwardness. It was a week later when the first strange thing happened. Mike had been out late, grabbing drinks with a couple of coworkers. When he got back, the apartment was dark, except for the faint light creeping out from under Ben's door. Mike headed straight for his room, but as he passed the living room, he caught something in the corner of his eye. The door to Ben's room was ajar, just slightly, but enough for Mike to catch a glimpse of something unsettling. The room was filled with old dusty boxes, stacks of paper, and what looked like Old medical equipment bazaar, outdated stuff like for stands and heart monitors. Mike frowned. Why would Ben need that? His curiosity got the better of him, and he leaned in closer. But then the door creaked open further, and Ben was standing there, staring at him, his face pale in the dim light. His eyes were wide and dark, almost hollow, like he hadn't slept in days. "Can I help you with something?" Ben's voice was low, almost a growl. Startled, Mike quickly backed away. "Sorry, man. I didn't mean to. I was just heading to bed." Ben didn't respond, just watched Mike with that intense, unblinking stare, until he retreated to his room and shut the door. After that, things got weirder. Late at night, Mike began hearing voices low, murmuring conversations that seemed to echo through the thin walls of the apartment. It was always around a.m., when the city outside was dead quiet, and the only sound should have been the occasional car passing by. But instead, Mike would lie awake, listening to the faint sound of someone talking, arguing in Ben's room. He could never make out the words, but the tone was frantic, angry, like someone was in the middle of a heated fight. The thing was, Ben was the only one who ever came in or out of the apartment. As far as Mike knew, Ben didn't have friends over, and certainly not in the middle of the night. One night, Mike couldn't take it anymore. He banged on Ben's door, demanding to know what the hell was going on. The voices immediately stopped, replaced by an eerie, suffocating silence. Ben opened the door just a crack, his face gaunt and ghostly in the dim light. "You should mind your own business, Mike," he whispered. Then he shut the door before Mike could even respond. The next morning, Mrs. Henderson came by to check on the place. Mike seized the opportunity to ask her about Ben, about whether anyone else had noticed strange things in the apartment. The old woman just smiled, her thin lips curling in that same unsettling way. "Ben's a quiet boy," she said, her voice almost too cheery. "I've never had any complaints." Mike wasn't buying it. Something was wrong with Ben, with the apartment. The tension in the air was getting heavier, the voices more frequent. He started locking his door at night, half expecting to wake up to find Ben standing over him. Then came the night that broke everything wide open. It was past midnight, and Mike was lying in bed, wide awake, when he heard the voices again. But this time, they were different, louder, more desperate. They sounded like screams. Horrified, panicked screams coming from Ben's room. Mike jumped out of bed and rushed to the door, banging on it with all his strength. "Ben, what's going on in there?" No response. The screams intensified, blending with deep, guttural moans, like someone or something was dying inside. Mike panicked. He backed away, unsure of what to do. But then the door to Ben's room slowly creaked open on its own, revealing the dark interior. There was no one there. The room was empty, completely empty. No boxes, no equipment, no sign of Ben. It was as though the room had been abandoned for years, a thick layer of dust covering every surface. Mike's heart raced as he stepped inside, the air cold and stale. The bed was stripped bare, just a rusted old frame and a stained mattress. And then he saw a large, dark stain on the floor, right in the center of the room. It looked like blood. Suddenly, footsteps echoed behind him, and Mike spun around to see Mrs. Henderson standing in the doorway, her face expressionless. "He's gone," she said, her voice unnervingly calm. "He's been gone for years." "What? What do you mean?" Mike stammered, backing away from the stain. Mrs. Henderson stepped closer, her eyes locking onto his. "Ben died in that room, Mike. Years ago. The landlord before me rented this place to him, but he didn't last long. Night after night, He complained of voices, of strange things happening in his room. He said something was in there with him, something that wouldn't leave him alone. Then one night, he disappeared. All that was left was that stain. Mike's breath caught in his throat. But I've been living with him. I've seen him. Mrs. Henderson shook her head slowly. You've seen something, but it wasn't Ben. Not anymore. Mike left the apartment the next day, leaving his key with Mrs. Henderson. He never went back, never spoke to her again. He didn't care about his deposit, didn't care about his stuff. Whatever had been in that apartment, it wasn't human. Story 3. The Empty Bed. Megan never thought much about having a roommate. She'd lived with plenty during her time at college, some good, some bad. When she found the listing for a cheap room in a shared apartment just outside the city, she didn't hesitate to jump on it. The place was a steal for its location, and even though the building was old and a little run down, it was still better than paying for a studio she could barely afford. Her new roommate, a girl named Hannah, had been the one to post the ad. When they met, Hannah seemed nice, quiet, maybe a bit distant, but that wasn't a deal-breaker for Megan. They weren't there to be best friends. The first few weeks went smoothly. Megan worked long hours at her new job as a paralegal, and Hannah worked odd shifts at a local restaurant. Most days, they barely saw each other. The only thing that struck Megan as odd was that Hannah never used her room. Megan would catch glimpses of her sleeping on the couch or sitting in the living room late at night, scrolling through her phone. When she asked about it, Hannah brushed it off. Just more comfortable out here, she said with a shrug, her eyes not quite meeting Megan's. The room's too stuffy. That was fine with Megan. She didn't care where Hannah slept, as long as she paid rent and didn't cause any drama. But still, something about it bugged her how Hannah would avoid the bedroom as though something was wrong with it. Sometimes Megan would catch her staring at the door, eyes wide and tense, like she was waiting for something to happen. Then came the noises. It started on a Saturday night. Megan was in her room, trying to catch up on sleep after a long week, when she woke to the sound of something. Tapping. It was faint, rhythmic, almost like someone was drumming their fingers on the wall. Tap, tap, tap. She groaned, rolled over, and tried to ignore it, but the noise didn't stop. If anything, it grew louder, more insistent. Tap, tap, tap. Annoyed, she grabbed her phone to check the time. 3:16 a.m. She pulled her pillow over her head, figuring it was just the old building settling. But then she heard something else, a voice, low and muffled, coming from the other side of the wall. It sounded like Hannah. Megan sat up in bed, her heart starting to race. Was Hannah in the next room, talking to someone? That didn't make sense. The wall her bed was against separated her room from Hannah's, and Hannah never used her room. Curiosity got the best of her. She climbed out of bed and quietly padded into the hallway. The apartment was dark, the only light coming from the street lamps outside, casting long shadows on the walls. She moved toward Hannah's closed bedroom door and pressed her ear against it. At first, there was only silence. Then she heard it again, a soft, strained whisper. It was definitely Hannah's voice, but the words were too quiet to make out. Hannah, Megan called, her voice low but firm. The whispering stopped. Megan's pulse quickened as she knocked on the door. Hannah, are you in there? Nothing. She tried the handle. It wasn't locked, but when she pushed the door open, the room was dark, the air inside cold and stale. She reached for the light switch and flicked it on, her eyes scanning the space. The room was empty. Hannah's bed was made, though it looked like it hadn't been slept in for days if ever. The closet door was slightly ajar, but there was no sign of Hannah or anyone else. Megan felt a chill crawl down her spine as she stepped into the room. Something about the air felt wrong, heavy, like the room hadn't been disturbed in years. She walked over to the bed and sat on the edge, her fingers brushing the old quilt that covered the mattress. It was cold, colder than it should have been. Then she noticed something strange. The pillow on the bed, it had an indentation, as though someone had been lying there, pressing their head into it. But the sheets were untouched, smooth as if no one had ever gotten into bed. Megan stood up quickly, the feeling of unease growing stronger by the second. She backed out of the room, shutting the door behind her, and headed for the living room. Hannah was there, sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the TV. "Were you just in your room?" Megan asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Hannah didn't look at her, just kept her eyes fixed on the screen. "No, I heard something in there. A voice. It sounded like you." Finally, Hannah turned to face her, her expression eerily calm. "I don't go in there," she said, her voice flat. "Neither should you." Megan felt a shiver crawl up her spine. "Why?" Hannah's eyes darkened. "You don't want to know." After that night, the noises continued, tapping, whispering, soft creaks that always seemed to come from inside Hannah's room. Megan started to notice other things too. Objects would be moved, small things like cups, books, or her keys. Once, she came home to find her bedroom window wide open, even though she was certain she'd closed it before leaving for work. The apartment grew colder, the air heavier with each passing day, as though the very walls were absorbing whatever was happening inside. Megan tried to talk to Hannah about it, but every time she brought it up, Hannah would brush her off with the same cryptic warning, "Just stay out of the room. You'll be fine." But Megan wasn't fine. The stress of it all, the sleepless nights, the constant unease was wearing on her. She started avoiding the apartment altogether, spending more time at work, at friends' places, anywhere but home. Still, no matter how much she tried to escape it, the thought of that room gnawed at her. Then, one night, everything came to a head. Megan was in bed, tossing and turning, unable to sleep. The tapping had started up again, louder this time, more aggressive, as if something was trying to get her attention. Tap, tap, tap. She squeezed her eyes shut, willing it to stop, but the noise grew louder. And then came the whispering, a low, insistent murmur, rising in pitch until it sounded like someone was screaming right next to her ear. Her eyes snapped open, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't take it anymore. She had to know. Ignoring the icy dread creeping through her veins, Megan threw off the covers and marched to Hannah's room. She didn't knock this time. She pushed the door open, flicking the light on. The room was empty, just as it had always been. But this time, there was something else, something new. In the center of the bed, the blankets had been pulled back, revealing the mattress beneath. And there, lying in the center, was a single, dark shape. It was a body. Megan froze, her breath catching in her throat. The figure on the bed was small, curled up in the fetal position, its back to her. Its clothes were tattered, its hair matted and dirty. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. Slowly, Megan stepped closer, her heart pounding in her ears. She reached out, her fingers trembling, and gently touched the figure's shoulder. It was cold, deathly cold. The figure stirred slightly, a soft, ragged breath escaping its lips. Megan's heart stopped as the figure began to turn, its movements slow and deliberate. When it finally faced her, Megan stumbled back, choking on a scream. It was Hannah, or at least, it looked like her. But her skin was pale, almost translucent, her eyes sunken and lifeless, her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. "Megan," the thing whispered, its voice thin and rasping. "You shouldn't have come in here." The next morning, Megan packed her bags and left the apartment without a word. She didn't tell anyone what she had seen, didn't call the police. She didn't need to. She knew, deep down, that whatever had been living in that room wasn't Hannah not anymore. She never went back. Hey there, it's Mr. Night Horror. If you enjoyed this eerie journey and want to dive deeper into the shadows with us, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Thanks for watching, and I'll be back with more spine-chilling tales tomorrow. Stay haunted.